The sound of someone laughing at your dream stays with you far longer than the dream itself. I learned that on a rainy Tuesday evening sitting across from my husband at our kitchen table. My name is Emily Carter, and if you had told me 5 years ago that the same man who laughed at my business idea would one day ask me for a job, I would have thought you were crazy. At the time, I was 41 years old, working a steady office job, and carrying around an idea that refused to leave me alone. For years, friends and neighbors had asked me for help organizing their homes, planning events, and creating systems that made their busy lives easier. It was something I genuinely enjoyed. Eventually, I started wondering whether I could turn that skill into a real business. The idea excited me. It also terrified me. One evening, after spending weeks researching and building a simple business plan, I finally decided to tell my husband. Brian came home from work carrying his usual takeout bag and dropped into a chair at the kitchen table. After dinner, I gathered my courage and showed him my notes. I explained how I wanted to start a professional home organization and consulting business. I talked about local demand. I talked about marketing. I talked about how I could begin on weekends and gradually grow the company over time. Brian listened quietly for about 30 seconds. Then he laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a nervous laugh. A real laugh. The kind of laugh people make when they think something is ridiculous. At first, I thought he was joking. Then I looked at his face. He was not joking at all. "You are serious?" he asked. I nodded. He laughed again. "Emily, people are not going to pay someone to organize closets and garages." I felt my excitement immediately shrink. Still, I tried defending the idea. I explained that professional organizing had become a growing industry. I showed him examples of successful businesses. Brian waved his hand dismissively. "This sounds like a hobby, not a company." The conversation only became worse from there. Every concern I raised was met with another joke. Every plan was met with another reason it would fail. By the end of the evening, my business proposal had become entertainment. The next morning, Brian repeated the story to a friend over breakfast. He laughed while telling it. His friend laughed too. I stood at the kitchen counter pretending not to care. But I cared. More than I wanted to admit. The easiest thing would have been giving up. The safest thing would have been accepting that maybe Brian was right. Maybe I was too old to start over. Maybe I was not qualified. Maybe my dream really was foolish. Yet something inside me refused to let go. Later that night, after Brian had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at my notes. The laughter still echoed in my mind. Instead of throwing the papers away, I opened my laptop and began working. I did not know it then, but that decision would change the course of both our lives. For the next several months, my life settled into a routine that felt both exhausting and strangely exciting. Every morning, I went to my regular job. Every evening, I came home, ate dinner, and spent hours working on my business. Most nights, I stayed up past midnight researching clients, building a website, creating service packages, and learning everything I could about running a company. The spare space in our garage slowly transformed into a small office. I bought a second-hand desk from a local thrift store. I found an inexpensive chair online. I hung a whiteboard on the wall and filled it with goals, deadlines, and ideas. To me, it felt like the beginning of something important. To Brian, it looked like a phase that would eventually disappear. He never missed an opportunity to remind me of that. Whenever friends visited, he would joke about my corporate headquarters in the garage. If family members asked how things were going, he would grin and say, "Emily is trying to become the queen of closet organization." Everyone laughed. I usually forced a smile and changed the subject. What hurt was not the jokes themselves. It was the fact that he never once asked how the business was actually doing. He never asked what I was learning or whether I needed support. It was as though he had already decided the outcome and saw no reason to take any of it seriously. One Saturday afternoon, I spent nearly 6 hours redesigning my website. I was proud of the result. The site looked professional. The branding felt polished. For the first time, I thought potential clients might actually trust me. Excited, I called Brian into the garage and showed him what I had created. He looked at the screen for less than 30 seconds. Then he shrugged. "Looks nice," he said. "But nobody is paying hundreds of dollars for advice about where to put their socks." He laughed at his own joke before walking away. I sat there staring at the computer monitor long after he left. A small voice in my head kept asking whether he might be right. Building something from nothing is lonely. Building something while someone close to you doubts every step is even harder. Still, I kept going. Every evening, I completed another task, another page on the website, another marketing plan, another online certification. Progress came slowly, but it came. Then one night, something happened that changed everything. Around 11 o'clock, while I was answering emails in the garage, a notification appeared on my phone. At first, I assumed it was spam. Instead, it was a message from a woman named Linda Parker. She had found my website and wanted help organizing her home before hosting a large family reunion. She asked whether I was accepting clients. I read the message 3 times to make sure it was real. Then I sat back in my chair and smiled. It was only one inquiry, one potential customer, one small opportunity. But after months of hearing that my dream was unrealistic, seeing that message felt like proof that someone out there believed my services had value. And for the first time since this journey began, that belief mattered more than Brian's laughter. The following Saturday morning, I drove to Linda Parker's house with a trunk full of supplies and enough nervous energy to power an entire city block. During the drive, I kept imagining everything that could go wrong. What if she hated my ideas? What if she thought I was inexperienced? What if this was my first and last client? By the time I pulled into her driveway, my hands were shaking. Linda lived in a beautiful 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood about 20 minutes from ours. She greeted me at the front door with a warm smile and immediately made me feel welcome. Within minutes, she was walking me through rooms filled with overflowing closets, crowded storage spaces, and years of accumulated belongings. As she explained her challenges, something unexpected happened. My nervousness disappeared. This was what I knew how to do. This was what I loved. For the next several hours, we worked together creating systems, organizing spaces, and developing practical solutions that fit her lifestyle. Linda asked thoughtful questions. She listened carefully. Most importantly, she respected my expertise. It had been so long since someone treated me like a professional that I almost forgot what it felt like. By late afternoon, the transformation was remarkable. Closets were functional. Storage areas were organized. The guest room looked twice as large. Linda walked through the house, smiling from room to room. "I cannot believe this is the same house," she said. Hearing those words filled me with a sense of accomplishment I had not experienced in years. Before I left, Linda paid my invoice without hesitation. Then she did something even more important. She asked for extra business cards. "Several of my friends need this kind of help," she said. "I am going to tell them about you." I thanked her and drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The first payment was not life-changing. It was only a few $100s, but it represented something much bigger than money. It was proof. Proof that someone valued what I offered. Proof that the business could work. When I got home, Brian was watching television in the living room. I told him about the appointment and showed him the payment notification on my phone. He looked surprised for a moment. Then he shrugged. One customer does not make a company. The excitement I had carried home immediately faded. Somehow, he always found a way to minimize every achievement. Yet this time his opinion did not hit quite as hard. Maybe it was because I had spent the day helping a real client. Maybe it was because someone outside our house had finally believed in me. Over the next 2 weeks, Linda referred 3 friends. Then one of those friends referred another client. Soon, I found myself scheduling consultations on weekends and weekday evenings. My calendar slowly began filling with appointments. The garage office that once seemed like a joke started feeling like the headquarters of something real. Every new client brought another success story. Every completed project brought another referral. And while Brian continued treating the business like a temporary distraction, I began noticing something different. For the first time since I started this journey, I was no longer trying to prove my dream was possible. I was watching it become reality. Over the next 6 months, the business grew faster than I ever imagined. What started as a single referral from Linda Parker turned into a steady stream of clients. My evenings and weekends became fully booked. Soon, I was helping homeowners, small business owners, and even local real estate agents prepare properties for sale. Every successful project led to another recommendation. Every recommendation brought another opportunity. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something that truly belonged to me. Yet despite all the progress, Brian's attitude never seemed to change. If anything, his comments became more frustrating. Whenever I mentioned a new client, he found a way to dismiss it. Whenever I shared a positive review, he acted unimpressed. One evening, I excitedly told him that a local real estate office wanted to discuss a partnership. The agents had noticed my work through mutual clients and believed my services could help homes sell faster. To me, it felt like a major breakthrough. Brian barely looked up from his phone. "Do not get carried away," he said. "People promise things all the time." Another night, I celebrated reaching a revenue goal that I had spent nearly a year chasing. I printed the report and placed it on the kitchen counter. Brian glanced at it and shrugged. "That is nice," he said, "but it is not exactly a Fortune 500 company." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I needed his approval, but because I could not understand why he seemed incapable of offering support. The strange thing was that people outside our house were beginning to see my value long before he did. Clients sent thank you messages. Local businesses asked for meetings. One customer even wrote an online review describing my company as life-changing. Every week brought another sign that the business was becoming something real. Then an unexpected opportunity arrived. A property management company contacted me about organizing multiple rental units before new tenants moved in. The project was larger than anything I had handled before. It would require long hours, detailed planning, and coordination with several teams. It was also the most profitable contract I had ever been offered. I spent days preparing a proposal. When the company accepted it, I sat alone in my garage office staring at the signed agreement. The contract was worth more than my first several months of business combined. I wanted to celebrate. I wanted to share the moment with the person who was supposed to be my partner. That evening, I showed Brian the paperwork. For a brief moment, I thought he might finally acknowledge what I had accomplished. Instead, he laughed softly and said, "Well, enjoy it while it lasts. Businesses come and go." I remember looking at him and feeling something shift inside me. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. For years, I had measured my progress against his opinions. But standing there with a signed contract in my hands and a growing company behind me, I realized something important. Brian had never actually been evaluating my business. He had made up his mind about it from the very beginning. And no amount of success was going to change that. At least, not yet. The large contract changed everything. Over the following year, the business expanded far beyond what I had originally imagined sitting alone in that garage office. The property management company renewed its agreement and referred me to other firms. Real estate agencies began recommending my services to sellers preparing homes for the market. Local business owners hired me to organize offices, storage, facilities, and workspaces. My calendar stayed full months in advance. What surprised me most was how quickly opportunities multiplied once a few people trusted my work. One successful project led to another. One satisfied client opened the door to 3 more. Before long, I faced a challenge I had never expected. I could not handle the workload alone. For weeks, I resisted the idea of hiring help. The business felt personal. Every client interaction mattered. Every project reflected my reputation. Yet there were only so many hours in a day. Eventually, after missing a few opportunities because my schedule was completely booked, I accepted reality. If the company was going to continue growing, I needed a team. The decision terrified me almost as much as starting the business in the first place. Hiring employees meant responsibility. It meant payroll, training, and leadership. Still, I moved forward. I rented a small office space in a professional building about 15 minutes from our house. The day I signed the lease, I sat alone in the empty room and looked around at the blank walls. A year earlier, I had been working from a second-hand desk in a garage while people laughed at my dream. Now I was opening my first real office. The moment felt surreal. I hired my first employee a month later, then a second, then a third. Each person brought new energy and new ideas. Together, we accomplished more than I could have managed alone. Revenue increased steadily. Clients continued arriving. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe the company had a future beyond me. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside our household. Brian's attitude had not exactly improved, but it had changed. The jokes became less frequent. The dismissive comments became less confident. He still rarely praised my accomplishments, yet he seemed unable to ignore them anymore. One evening, he walked through the office while I was reviewing financial reports at home. He stopped when he saw a document on my desk. "You hired 3 employees?" he asked. I nodded. He studied the report for a moment before setting it back down. "That is more people than I expected." It was not a compliment, but it was probably the closest thing to one I had received from him in years. A few weeks later, I attended a local business networking event and was invited to speak about entrepreneurship at a community workshop. Standing in front of that audience, sharing my journey, I realized how much my life had changed. The woman who once doubted herself after hearing laughter across a kitchen table was slowly disappearing. In her place stood someone more confident, more capable, and more certain of her own value. What I did not realize at the time was that while my company was climbing higher than ever, Brian's career was beginning to move in the opposite direction. And very soon, both of our worlds were about to change. The first sign that something was wrong appeared on a Thursday evening. Brian came home much earlier than usual and walked through the front door carrying a cardboard box. At first, I assumed he was bringing home office supplies or clearing out old files. Then I saw his face. The confidence that normally defined him was gone. He set the box on the kitchen counter and stood there quietly for several seconds. "What happened?" I asked. He looked away before answering. "The company eliminated my position." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Brian had worked for the same company for more than 15 years. His career had always seemed stable. He had climbed through management, earned promotions, and built a reputation as someone who knew the business inside and out. The possibility of losing his job had never seemed realistic. Yet there he was standing in our kitchen with a cardboard box and nowhere to go the next morning. Over the following weeks, life changed quickly. At first, Brian remained optimistic. He updated his resume, contacted former colleagues, and submitted applications. He told everyone he would find another position soon. I believed him. His experience was impressive. His professional network was large. Surely opportunities would appear. But weeks turned into months. Interviews came and went. Promising conversations led nowhere. The job market had changed more than either of us realized. Positions that once attracted a handful of applicants now attracted hundreds. Companies moved slowly. Hiring freezes appeared unexpectedly. Every rejection seemed to chip away at Brian's confidence. Meanwhile, my company continued expanding. New clients arrived every week. Additional partnerships developed. Revenue continued climbing. The contrast between our professional lives became impossible to ignore. One evening, I returned home after signing a new commercial contract. The agreement represented another major milestone for the business. I was excited to share the news. Instead, I found Brian sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at his laptop. Another rejection email had arrived that afternoon. I quietly set my contract folder aside and changed the subject. For the first time, celebrating my success felt uncomfortable. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I could see how much Brian was struggling. As the months passed, something else began happening. The comments disappeared. The jokes stopped. The dismissive remarks that once seemed constant became rare. Brian no longer laughed when discussing my company. In fact, he started asking questions. Real questions. How many clients do you have now? How many employees are on the team? How large was the latest contract? The curiosity felt strange after years of skepticism. One afternoon, I was reviewing applications in my office when my operations manager entered carrying several folders. "We need another project coordinator," she said. "The workload is growing faster than expected." She was right. Our team was stretched thin. New projects were arriving faster than we could comfortably manage. We agreed to begin interviewing candidates immediately. That evening, while driving home, I found myself thinking about how different life looked compared to the night I first shared my business idea. Back then, I was fighting to convince people the company could exist. Now, I was worrying about how quickly it was growing. What I did not know was that within days, one particular job application would land on my desk, and the name at the top would leave me completely speechless. 3 days later, I was sitting in my office reviewing applications for the new project coordinator position when my operations manager dropped a folder onto my desk. We had received dozens of resumes. Some applicants had impressive backgrounds. Others were looking for a fresh start. I began working through the stack one by one. Then I reached a familiar name. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. I looked again. Brian Carter. My husband. I stared at the application longer than I probably should have. Attached to it was a carefully updated resume highlighting years of management experience, team leadership, and operational oversight. Everything was professionally prepared. Everything looked serious. Yet I could not stop thinking about the night he laughed at my business plan across the kitchen table. The contrast felt almost impossible to ignore. I closed the folder and sat quietly for several minutes. Part of me wanted to laugh at the situation. Another part felt sad. Life had a strange way of bringing people back to moments they never expected to revisit. That evening, Brian and I ate dinner together as usual. Neither of us mentioned the application. I was curious whether he would bring it up first. He did not. Instead, he asked about a new client contract my company had recently secured. The conversation remained polite but careful. There was a tension beneath the surface that neither of us acknowledged. The following afternoon, I received an email from Human Resources confirming that Brian had formally requested an interview. Reading those words felt surreal. Years earlier, he had treated my business like a temporary hobby. Now he was applying through the same hiring process as everyone else. My operations manager suggested scheduling him for the following week. I agreed. The interview would be conducted professionally and fairly. No special treatment. No shortcuts. No exceptions. Word spread quickly inside the company that an experienced management candidate had entered the hiring process. Several team members reviewed his qualifications and expressed interest. On paper, Brian was a strong applicant. His experience aligned well with the role. His leadership background could benefit the organization. For the first time, I was forced to separate the husband I knew at home from the candidate sitting inside the application file. Then the interview day arrived. I woke up unusually nervous. Not because I doubted my ability to lead the meeting, but because I understood the emotional weight behind it. By mid-morning, I was seated in a conference room with two members of the management team. Through the glass wall, I watched candidates arrive and check in at reception. Then I saw Brian walk through the front doors. He wore a navy suit and carried a professional portfolio. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the lobby. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us looked away. A few minutes later, he entered the conference room and took a seat on the opposite side of the table. The silence felt enormous. Years earlier, I had sat across from him asking for support. Now he sat across from me hoping for an opportunity. The power shift was impossible to ignore. Yet as I looked at him, I realized something surprising. I did not feel anger. I did not feel revenge. I simply felt the weight of how far both of us had traveled to arrive at this moment. And the most important question was no longer whether Brian needed a job. The question was whether he had finally learned to respect the dream he once laughed at. The interview lasted nearly an hour. From the outside, it probably looked like any other professional meeting. Questions were asked. Experience was discussed. Responsibilities were reviewed. Yet beneath every answer and every pause existed years of history that nobody else in the room could fully understand. Brian handled himself well. His management experience was genuine. His leadership background was strong. He answered difficult questions thoughtfully and demonstrated skills that would clearly benefit the company. As the conversation continued, I found myself impressed by the professionalism he brought into the room. For years, I had known him as my husband. Now I was seeing him through an entirely different lens. Eventually, one of the managers asked a question about adaptability and professional growth. Brian paused longer than usual before answering. Then he said something that surprised me. The biggest lesson I have learned recently is that success does not always look the way you expect it to. The room became very quiet. He continued speaking. Sometimes the opportunities you dismiss are the ones you should pay attention to. Sometimes the people you underestimate end up teaching you the most. Nobody else understood the deeper meaning behind those words. But I did. For the first time since this entire journey began, I sensed genuine humility in his voice. The interview ended shortly afterward. Brian thanked everyone for their time and left the conference room. As the door closed behind him, the management team immediately began discussing the candidates. Several people believed Brian was one of the strongest applicants we had interviewed. His qualifications matched the role. His experience could help us continue expanding. Objectively, they were right. Over the next 2 days, we completed final evaluations. Every candidate was reviewed according to the same standards. Every decision was documented. Every recommendation was carefully considered. Throughout the process, I remained determined to separate personal history from professional judgment. The company deserved fairness. The applicants deserved fairness. Most importantly, I deserved fairness. On Friday afternoon, the leadership team reached a decision. Brian was selected for the position. Before Human Resources could send the official offer, I requested a private meeting. I wanted the conversation to happen face-to-face. Late that afternoon, Brian arrived at my office. The atmosphere felt very different from the interview. There were no managers, no evaluation forms, no audience, just the two of us sitting across from one another. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I handed him the offer letter. He stared at the document before finally looking up. "Does this mean what I think it means?" he asked quietly. I nodded. The relief on his face was immediate. Yet what happened next mattered far more than the job offer itself. Brian leaned back in his chair and looked around the office. The framed company awards, the busy team outside, the organization that had grown from a folding table in a garage. Then he looked at me and smiled sadly. "I owe you an apology." Those words carried more weight than any business contract I had ever signed. He admitted that he never believed the company would succeed. He admitted that he had treated my dream like a joke. He admitted that watching it grow had forced him to confront his own assumptions. As I listened, I realized this moment was never really about employment. It was about recognition, respect, accountability, the things I had wanted from the beginning. And for the first time in years, it finally felt like we were having an honest conversation. The months that followed brought changes I never could have predicted on the night I first sat at that kitchen table with my business plan. Brian accepted the position and approached it with the same professionalism he had demonstrated during the interview process. From the beginning, he understood that he would be held to the same standards as every other employee. There would be no special treatment. There would be no shortcuts. To his credit, he never asked for any. Instead, he arrived early, worked hard, and focused on proving himself through effort rather than titles. Watching him adapt was both strange and encouraging. For years, our relationship had been shaped by assumptions. He assumed my business would fail. I assumed he would never understand why his laughter had hurt me so deeply. Yet life had a way of challenging both of us. As the company continued growing, our conversations gradually changed. We talked less about what had happened in the past and more about what we were building in the present. Brian began seeing firsthand the work required to run a successful business. He saw the long hours, the difficult decisions, the client expectations, and the responsibility that came with leading a team. One evening, several months after he joined the company, we stayed late preparing for a major presentation. The office was quiet. Most employees had already gone home. As we organized documents in a conference room, Brian suddenly stopped what he was doing. "You know," he said, "I spent years thinking success looked a certain way." I looked up from my laptop. He smiled slightly. "I thought it came from having the right title, the right company, the right career path. I never imagined it could start in a garage with a folding table." We both laughed softly. Then he said something I will never forget. "The biggest mistake I ever made was believing I understood your limits better than you did." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The words carried a sincerity that could not be manufactured. They came from experience. They came from humility. Most importantly, they came from growth. Looking back now, people often assume this story is about revenge. They imagine the satisfying part was watching the person who laughed at me become the person asking for help. But they are wrong. That was never the most important moment. The real victory happened much earlier. It happened the night I chose not to quit. It happened when I kept working despite the doubts. It happened every time I moved forward without permission from someone else. The business became successful. The company grew beyond anything I imagined. But the greatest change was not financial. It was personal. I learned that confidence is not built when everyone believes in you. Confidence is built when you continue moving forward after they do not. Today, the company employs a talented team, serves clients across the region, and continues expanding every year. Brian remains an important part of that journey. Our relationship is stronger because it is finally built on mutual respect instead of assumptions. Sometimes, when I walk through the office and see employees collaborating on projects that began as a simple idea scribbled on notebook paper, I think back to that rainy Tuesday evening. I remember the laughter. I remember the doubt. And I remember the decision that changed everything. In the end, success was never about proving someone else wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was capable all along.